First, Pastor Jen and I have been on vacation, so it's good to be back with all of you and to welcome you to our Adult Education Hour. We are so thrilled to have Dr. Ellen Davis with us this morning. When we started seminary, there was a list of books that was recommended to us of what we should read before we got started. And I don't know, Dr. Davis, if you knew that your book, Getting Involved with God, was on the list at Princeton Seminary of books you should read before you get started. And so we both read this book. We didn't know each other at the time. We weren't dating. And independently, it was just highly influential for us. We loved that book. And so when we started our doctoral program at Duke, we were excited to take a class with Dr. Davis, but unfortunately, just the timing of when she was teaching, that didn't line up. That's why we are ecstatic to have this conversation. So let me just introduce her to you. And we're going to have a Q&A session. Pastor Jen and I have prepared a few questions that we want to ask, particularly geared towards that book and what it means for us to get involved with God, rediscover the Old Testament, find the beauty of our sacred scriptures. And then if you all have questions, feel free to put them in the chat as we're going. And at the end, we can get to those chat questions, or we'll have an opportunity to open it up and have people ask additional questions as well. But Dr. Davis is a professor of both Bible and practical theology at Duke Divinity School, the author of 11 books, many articles, and her research interests focus on how biblical interpretation bears on the life of faith communities like ours, and how they help us respond to urgent public issues. And so I hope that can be part of what we discuss today. Something that I think you all should know is that when we offered Dr. Davis an honorarium for her time, she encouraged us to send what we would normally send to her to a doctoral student from Nigeria that she is connected to and is helping through an unfunded year of her doctoral program. And we were able to email with this person and actually schedule her to chat with us later this spring as well. And this doctoral student is doing incredible work in missions, is committed to going back to Africa to teach and deal with climate change and environmental issues as they relate to spirituality. So we're excited to hear from her later in the spring as well, and just honored to be able to be part of the global church to help another person who's involved with missions and her education. So let's jump in. Dr. Davis, welcome. And
thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for I'm sorry we didn't get to study together when you were at Duke, and thank you for your support for Eunice. That's wonderful.
Our honor. So to begin with, just about this book that was influential to the two of us, and it's a very accessible book. And so if any of you would like to get a hold of a copy, feel free to borrow ours or get one of your own. Again, the title is Getting Involved with God, Rediscovering the Old Testament. And to begin with, what motivated you to write this book? Why did you think this book was something that both the Academy and just the wider world needed?
I didn't actually. A friend of mine who was the editor, it was initially published by Cowley Press, and she was the editor there, and she asked me to write this book, and I said, I really don't have time to do that. And she said, just send me your stuff. Send me a box of your lectures and your sermons, and I'll find the book in it. So I did. And it actually took 4 years, I think, from the time I sent her that box until we published the book. And I said to her afterwards, this is a lot harder than you told me it was going to be. And I said, you knew that, didn't you? And she said, yes, I did. But if I told you, you wouldn't have done it. So it was, at that point, I was not intending to write a book for a general audience, which is what this book is. But for a long time, it was probably, and maybe still today, it may be the book that more people have read than other things, because it deals with, as you know, it deals with the texts that make people most uncomfortable in the Old Testament. So there it is.
Okay, well, just broadly, as we dig into the Old Testament, what do you think the Old Testament has to offer people? And I'd like to go into those questions of what we might classify as either boring or violent. I think people have a lot of questions about those. But just generally, what do you think the Old Testament has to offer people of faith?
Well, first of all, it's 3/4 of the Christian Bible. So if you only read the last quarter of the Christian Bible, you've kind of missed a lot of essential content. And I think what people call boring is probably lack of comprehension. It's we're accustomed on the whole to reading books that are plot driven. And the Bible on the whole is not plot driven. It's a very complex kind of literature, but it operates with different conventions than the airport novel, for instance, or the modern novel altogether. And so you need to learn how to get inside the story. And that's what I try to do in all of my teaching. I would say when you ask what it has to offer to people of faith, and that is, of course, both Christians and Jews, although we read the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament in very different ways. But I think of what Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, and when he was in Tegel prison in the last 2 years of his life, he said he found himself more and more reading the Old Testament, as he called it. And he said, anyone who comes to the New Testament too soon without having read the Old Testament is no Christian. So he was pretty firm on this point. And what he said, and this is, remember, this is the Third Reich. He said, using somewhat anachronistic language, the Old Testament puts the church in the center of the village. And what he meant by that is that it forces the community of faith to deal with all of the daily matters of living in community, of politics, of economics, of sleazy human character. The Old Testament puts the church in the center of the village, where you can't get away from all of that stuff. And it's relatively easy, although I think it's a mistake, to read the New Testament as a highly spiritualized text, as though it doesn't bear upon politics, economics, all the messy business of daily life. That's really, if you read the Old Testament Hebrew Bible with care, you really can't do that. It doesn't lend itself to that kind of abstraction from the dirty business of life.
Wow, that is incredibly powerfully said, that the Old Testament gives us this ability to ground ourselves in the messiness of life. And it's interesting that you mentioned Dietrich Bonhoeffer. That was another one of the texts that was our pre-seminary readings, was Life Together. Another book we recommend to everyone watching today. It's a very short book. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, if you don't know this individual, was someone who had an opportunity to stay in the United States, but went back to Germany during the Third Reich to work against what the established German church was doing, and was sent to a concentration camp where he was executed for trying to promote greater spirituality and faith within Germany at the time. So thank you so much for that reference. Jen, I know you have a question, but I want to take just a quick detour because of something you were talking about. You mentioned both Old Testament and Hebrew Bible. Could you tell us what the difference between those two terms are, or not the difference, and just what you recommend for churches liturgically when we're worshiping? Do you have any opinion on whether we should be using the term Old Testament or Hebrew Bible?
It's tricky, and there's no perfect answer to this question. The Jews call what Christians call the Old Testament, Jews call the Bible. full stop, because it is, that is the whole Bible for Jews. There are other canonical authoritative texts, Mishnah and Talmud, but for them, the Bible is Torah, prophets, and writings, our Old Testament. There's some changes in the order of the Christian Bible and the Hebrew Bible. We can talk about that if you want to. But essentially, it's the same text. To call it Hebrew Bible, which is a term that I use in my academic life, is misleading in the church's life, because the church does not read the Bible in Hebrew. You know, I do for my professional purposes, but that's not how the church reads it. So I have no problem with Old Testament and New Testament, as long as we don't read old as meaning antiquated. It's maybe better to think of it the way we think of old money. You know, it has a certain cachet, and it has a history that we value. Anyway, that's a beginning.
Great, thank you.
I love that. Think of it like old money. So going back, you talked a little bit about some of these texts being messy and how that's actually beneficial for a lot of us, and I think an accessible way to think about these scriptures, because some people approach the Bible with intimidation, but then you find these really messy stories, particularly in the Old Testament, and I think that's a way for people to connect with what's happening in that part of the Bible. But there are also stories that are incredibly violent and disturbing. So how do you suggest that people approach those that are beyond messy, but actually really traumatic?
First of all, I wouldn't start there. So and you need good guidance to do this, and in many cases the issues are extremely complex. So I'll just mention that I have written another book called Opening Israel Scriptures. It's kind of, I think of it sometimes as getting involved with God grown up. And so I published that 2019, I think. And that covers almost every book of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. So, and offers a more detailed and complex reading. So it's a question that you kind of have to ask text by text, book by book, what's going on there. And I mean, do you want to mention one that's really bothering you? And then I'll try to identify what I think are some of the key issues with it.
Well, I think the story of the concubine who's cut up into.
Okay. That story of the concubine who is hacked into 12 pieces and sent out to all the tribes of Israel. I think it's a symbol. It's a grotesque symbol, and the Bible is not shy of making use of the grotesque in order to make its point. So I think that the concubine is the concubine of a priest. I think she is not a real woman. I think she is feminized Israel. And feminized Israel being misled by its leadership, including its religious leadership. So she's hacked to pieces by her husband, the priest, and sent out to all the tribes of Israel. Well, I think what we're seeing is dismembered Israel. And And there's a very interesting, that story ends with a line that's addressed to us as the audience, which is, it reads something like, and everyone who sees it or her, you could translate the Hebrew either way, consider, take counsel, and decide. Now, most English translations make it seem that that's what the Levite is saying to the Israelites, but in fact, it's not addressed to them. It's addressed to the audience. It's a narrative. And I think this is the story of Israel's deterioration, moral and spiritual deterioration in the land. And I think that story is at the end of the book of Judges, is the ultimate confrontation with the horror of what happens when, as the book says, there is no king in Israel and everyone does what seems right in their own eyes. A person doing what seems right in their own eyes is never a good thing in the Bible. It's always a sign that they have completely alienated themselves from God. So, I mean, that's just one example. But it points to the fact that I think one thing one needs to be aware of, and I said this earlier, that we tend to read the Bible the way we might read a modern story. But ancient literature works in somewhat different ways, and it's heavily symbol laden. And so, as I say, I think this is a text that if you read it literally, it's pornographic. This is the problem that you saw, Pastor Jen. But it is, in fact, I think, a grotesque symbol trying to wake us up to what is going on in Israel.
Wow, powerfully said.
Incredibly powerful. I think we can identify with seeing, even in our own times, this idea that sometimes we need to be woken up to the grotesque realities of our world. And for someone to say, consider this, decide for yourself, is this the sort of ways we want humanity to act in our own modern times? Thank you for that. That was high level biblical interpretation.
That was
if you
great.
don't know that story, at the end of the book of Judges, it's one of the worst texts in scripture, when a man sends out his concubine to be raped and she lies dead on the threshold of the house, and he chops her up into 12 pieces and sends her to the 12 tribes of Israel. It's horrendous. And so thank you for helping us try to understand this. Jenna, corollary.
Let me add one other thing to that, if I may. I mean, one of the questions one has to always ask is, well, how do you know that I'm supposed to go to a symbolic level of reading?
Yes.
And actually, Augustine offered one answer to this in his De Doctrina Christiana on Christian teaching. He said, and his principle is that every scripture should tend to the love of God and love of neighbor. And if you're reading a text at the literal level and it doesn't do that, then you have to kick it up a level and read it at a non-literal level. I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's more complex, and Augustine understood complexity a whole lot better than I do. But at any rate, but part of the way to identify whether a text is to be read symbolically or not is to see what echoes you catch with other parts of scripture, because scripture is a continually self-referential. I'm torn between saying book or set of books, but it's always referring to other parts of the story, as that text does. And so when you begin to put them together, then you see that there's more complexity than one case of abuse of a woman. It's also the case, of course, that a symbol only makes sense if there is some kind of cultural reality that enables you to make sense of the symbol. Now, I think this is a grotesque symbol. It's stretched to the extreme, but it makes sense because we understand, as ancient Israelites understood, domestic abuse. We know there is such a thing, and have seen it in certain contexts. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah, wow.
Brilliant. I hope that everyone watching today can take that tool with them, that if you are reading a text and trying to understand how to read it, that is a great lens for everyone.
Mhm.
How does this help me love God, love neighbor? If the literal reading isn't doing that, then to change our lens.
Mhm.
That was brilliant. I just want to add, as a corollary to your question, Jen, I think what a lot of people wonder, and we talked about this in a worship service a couple months ago, how do you deal with the texts that seem to suggest God is condoning, if not demanding, the slaughter of men, women, and children and livestock?
Particularly, I think you're thinking of the Canaanites.
Yes.
Okay. And this gets really complicated. and again, I mean, this level of complication I'm explaining, not in getting involved with God, but in opening Israel's scriptures. By the time, this is largely, the key text here is the book of Joshua. Again, I don't take it literally. And so I always ask my students, I ask my D-Min students, because we work with this text, we deal with, you're asking the right question, because I think that violence in the scriptures is the question for your generation of interpreters. In my generation, it had more to do with women's status. That's not a moot point by any means, but I think in your generation, I notice that the key issues have to do with violence. So when I begin teaching the book of Joshua, which I have my doctoral students read, I say, so tell me the stories. Let's just get started here. Tell me the stories of the wicked Canaanites in the book of Joshua. Well, there aren't any. And so, and I said, tell me the stories of the irresponsible or wicked Israelites in the book of Joshua. Well, there are some. You also have two things going on in Joshua. You have the strand. It's like you have the party line and you have the sort of the challenging, the undermining of the party line. So the party line is all of the Canaanites were exterminated. The challenge to that is, well, in fact, the Canaanites weren't exterminated at all because the Israelites were not being faithful to God and they couldn't get rid of them. So the focus is actually on Israelite unfaithfulness. I think, and now I'm just going to fast forward. By the time the book of Joshua is written, and it's Deuteronomy, it belongs to the Deuteronomic strand in the Bible that approximately comes from the 7th century before the Common Era. This is 500 years after the story is set. There are no Canaanites in the land as groups, identifiable groups of people in the 7th century. And certainly there are none that are threatening Israel. What is threatening Israel is the great empire of Assyria. Biggest empire that had arisen in the ancient Near East to that point. And the Assyrians were geniuses at wiping out national and religious entities and mixing up ethnicities. They were geniuses at the politics of empire, you might say. And so they're pressing very, very hard on Israel at this point, which is largely reduced. The northern kingdom's been destroyed, largely reduced to a vassal kingdom or an semi-independent kingdom under huge pressure. And so I think that the call to resist the Canaanites, to eradicate their worship, is a call to resist the Assyrian threat. And the language that is, but it's not safe to say that. So I regard the book of Joshua as a kind of hidden transcript. It's using code language to talk about being faithful to Israel's God under threat. And it's sort of using this historical setting that doesn't exist anymore to make that point.
And if we use the approach that you and Augustine endorse, then we can start with this idea, okay, killing a whole community isn't love of God and neighbor.
And also informed by a certain kind of historical awareness that Israel was most of the time on the losing side of any international conflict or inter-ethnic conflict it was in. And so this is not, we tend to think of Israel and Judah as being super powerful. They were not. They were pin dots on the map of empire. And so that's the threat. And then Israel is positioning itself, trying to hold on to its identity. And it's telling that of all of the little Western Asian states that Assyria overran, Israel is the only one that survived, not just that, but further overrunnings by Babylon, Persians, Greeks. Israel is the only one that survived with its identity, including its religious identity, intact.
I would love to talk with you all day. This is amazing. Before we open it up for everyone, I think we need to squeeze in this question and this question. Do you agree?
Yeah.
Did you have another one you wanted to do?
This one and this one?
Just first.
Oh, okay.
If anyone in this conversation, and we have some retired clergy who I anticipate have spent a lot of time reading these scriptures, but for anyone on this call and in our audience today who have spent very little time with the Old Testament and want to start digging in and getting a little bit more knowledge of this sacred scripture, what advice do you have for them in terms of where they start? Because you mentioned earlier in our conversation, don't start with the complicated, violent stories. What do you recommend to people for reading the Old Testament and getting involved with it, rediscovering it, starting to discover it?
I'd start with Genesis. There's a reason Genesis is Genesis. And so in the book I've mentioned to you several times, which has essays on, as I say, almost all of the books of the Old Testament. I put a few of the minor prophets together. I have essays, 3 essays on Genesis. One deals with, I think the first one deals with creation. The second one deals with blessing and curses. I forget what the third one deals with. But you have all of the core issues in Genesis in a sense and many of the issues that are so pressing for us now. What is our relationship to what is the human relationship to the larger created order? So often when I'm teaching Genesis, the first thing I ask my students to do is just, and you can do this easily in English translation, just go through the first 11 chapters and notice the number of times soil, land, earth, the elements of our physical world are mentioned, and see in what context and what that tells you. Genesis, of course, is about, biblically speaking, the original dysfunctional family or dysfunctional families. So, all kinds of issues there that we continue to deal with. And politics. I mean, power dynamics in the story of Joseph, gender dynamics. So I would say start with, and take your time. Don't be in a rush.
Yeah, great advice. Okay, one last question from us, and then we'll open it up to others. Your bio says that our scripture interpretation should impact our response to important public issues like the ecological crisis, for example. Can you talk a little bit about how the Old Testament informs how we might approach topics like that?
Yeah. This is sort of current for me because I think it's now about 2 years ago, I sort of made an informal vow that whenever I was asked to give a lecture or a sermon, extraneous to my teaching responsibilities at Duke, I would speak in some way about climate change. And I thought that was going to be a fairly difficult vow to keep, and that I was going to have to be really selective in terms of maybe what I accepted, but also what texts I used. That is not the case at all. I was surprised that pretty much any text that I wanted to talk about enabled me in some way to illumine that issue. So I would say that one thing that's important first of all, from a biblical perspective, the earth, as God says in Leviticus, the land is mine. Any questions? So it is a theocentric, not anthropocentric, a God-centered reading of the world. The Bible in neither testament assumes that the earth as we know it is a permanent entity. I think this is actually one of the great values of the Bible altogether, that it can imagine a future drastically different than the present, and not always for the good. That's very, very hard for us to grasp. Somehow we think that whatever's happening, it's still going to continue pretty much the way things are now. It's not a biblical perspective.
Wow.
That's powerful.
That's powerful.
The Bible allows us to imagine a future very different from our own and not always for the good. Thank you for that.
Wow.
There's some great questions in the chat already. I'm going to take the first two, and then I'll come to folks in this room, see if anyone in here has a question, and then return to the chat. Mel, you started us off by asking Dr. Davis, after your extensive study of the history of scriptures, do you believe Jesus Christ was trying to start a new religion, or was he trying to reform Judaism?
I don't know. I have no special knowledge to answer that question. To tell you the truth, I never thought about it. And Jesus was a Jew. In the first century, as you doubtless know better than I do, Judaism is in tremendous flux. So you might say a lot of Jews are trying to reform Judaism. Paul for sure is doing something he regards as drastically different in light of who Jesus is. And And as you know, the question of Jesus's relationship with the Father and Jesus's self-consciousness of himself is a highly vexed issue on which that I am not equipped to illumine. So that's probably all I can say.
Yeah, thank you.
What I do think, I mean, what's important for me is that regardless of what Jesus may have thought was the future of Judaism or should be the future of Judaism, for Jesus, the Bible is the text that I seek to interpret. And so I often think, okay, as best I can tell, how is Jesus as represented by the evangelists reading this text?
Wow, wow. And as self-identified followers of Jesus, we should probably take seriously the only scriptures that Jesus knew. And that's why we're having this conversation.
Yeah.
Great.
Good.
Sandy asks, why does the Bible, as a text in our modern world that we're reading as Christians, for some create unity and for others creates division?
Would you repeat that? I think I missed the first part of the question.
Yeah. She writes, why does the Bible for some create unity and others it creates division? Sandy, correct me if I'm reading your question incorrectly.
I see.
But
Okay, I
read
found it.
You know, some people are reading a text and it motivates us to be united with others. For some, they're reading the same text and it creates division between communities.
Well, I don't think the Bible is doing that. I think that it is what those some and others are looking for. So I'm not sure, as a biblical scholar, I'm not sure I can illumine that question because, as I say, I don't think it's inherent to the text. I will comment that over the last probably dozen years, increasingly, when I'm teaching, I teach with a colleague, not just a single colleague, but one of several colleagues who reads scripture from a significantly different perspective than I do. Because I think that is, I think that's really crucial in this time. And this question points to exactly why it is crucial. And it's not something on the whole that most of us are equipped to do, because most of us read scripture with other people who think more or less the same way we do. That's why we go to this church and not to that church. Or that's why we read these books and not those books. So for me, most frequently, the conversation partners I teach with are Jews or Muslims. And so starting Wednesday of this week, I will be teaching a class with Rabbi Shai Held, an Orthodox Jew in New York City, and Makoto Fujimura, who's a painter, a Christian. But Makoto Fujimura himself has a more probably evangelical bent than I do. So with three people coming together, teaching the Psalms, and I expect that to be challenging and eye-opening. And the goal is not that we should all agree. I think that would be a very self-defeating goal, but that we should understand a little bit better how others think. And so the first class session that we're going to do, I'm giving you a for instance in response to this. I mean, I see the point that it does. For some, it creates, I'm not even sure unity is a particularly valuable goal if unity means we all agree. if unity means we can listen to each other with respect, then I'm all for it. And so the first session Shai held, again, an Orthodox Jew, is going to talk about why it's quite difficult as a theologically interested person to do biblical interpretation in a field that is dominated by Christians who, on the whole, are not interested in what Jews have to say about Scripture. And so we're going to talk about that. And one of the things that we talked about when we were planning the first session is I said to him, you need to understand that a significant difference, as I perceive it, between Jews and Christians in looking at Scripture is that Jews think Scripture, they don't assume that they know what any text means, and that's why they study. Christians, on the whole, tend to think that they do know what a text means, and therefore it's hardly even worth talking about. And he was stunned into silence and said, well, that is a different universe. But it's, it's striking to me that when I go to Jerusalem, my Orthodox Jewish friends will say to me, can we have some time to study together? I almost never hear that from my Christian friends. And the assumption is that I'm going to see it differently than they do, and that's why they'd like to study with me, even though they've been studying all their lives and know Hebrew much, much better than I do.
Wow, that is a very powerful way to reframe that question.
Thank you.
Valuing not having pure unity. Jack, your question's great. Let's touch on that. Is there anyone in the room that has something they want to ask?
Well, I'm just curious as to how Southern Christians use the Bible to justify white supremacy and slavery, and the cruel nature of slavery for hundreds of years. I have a hard time reconciling that.
How did it happen that Southern Christians, thank you, Tomas, that Southern Christians were able to use Scripture to justify white supremacy and slavery for hundreds of years?
That's a really complicated question, as you all know. But as a starting point, I would say that one factor is that in the biblical world, this is not just the Old Testament, of course, it is also the New Testament. Slavery is assumed. That does not mean it is regarded as a good. I don't think either testament regards slavery as a good, but it is a cultural fact. And there is in neither testament an absolute prohibition on slavery. There are, I would say, we see running through the whole Christian Bible, both testaments, we see a trajectory that is moving in that direction, but never achieves it. So that's part of the historical and text and canonical complication that enabled people to argue on both sides of this issue. But just to sort of lay out some key points in that trajectory, there is, of course, in Exodus, and when you finish studying Genesis, you should read Exodus. Exodus, of course, has a negative representation of slavery that remains in Israel's memory and echoes through all of Scripture. That slavery is slavery in the iron furnace, as Deuteronomy calls Egypt. is a bad thing. In Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, all three of the books of the Bible that have major law codes in them, prominent attention is given to the limitation of debt slavery in Israel, which is the most common form of slavery in Israel, that people would, farmers would be unable to pay their exceedingly high taxes, which were paid in kind, and which is to say they were paid in crops. And that could be a third to a half or more of a farmer's income. In the land of Israel, which is very marginal for agriculture anyway, 4 out of 10 years of drought years. Often farmers are falling behind, they put their children into indentured slavery, they hawk their land, ultimately they put their own bodies, the head of the household puts his own body into indentured slavery. Israel, this is obviously an abiding problem in Israelite society because every single law code deals with it. It's a problem they never licked. So that is the beginning, I would say, the attempts to address this problem and limit slavery, prevent intergenerational slavery with the Jubilee. These are all ways of limiting an evil, but there is no absolute prohibition, as I say, in either testament. And I'm no expert on the social world of the Western Levant through the centuries, but I think the reality is that because it is so foundational to the economy, it can be condemned, it can be limited, but absolutely prohibiting it seems to be beyond where any of the biblical writers get to.
Yeah.
Much as they expose the evils of it.
Thank you. Jack's question will be our last question, and then we'll get to worship, which starts in just a couple minutes here. As a layperson, it seems that the Old Testament God is A, very present and immediate in the lives of the followers, and B, God takes sides. In our current era of science and multicultural celebration of all cultures and peoples, how do we relate to the Old Testament God?
In 90 seconds. Okay, I would say A is sort of easier to talk about. Very present and immediate in the lives of the followers, sometimes not. And so I would say, I was just this week teaching the book of Ruth and the book of Esther. Those are two instances in which God is more present or not. God is represented more the way we think of God, not super hands-on. So I would say it varies, and the poetics of scripture vary, even within the book of Genesis. The God of the first 11 chapters or the patriarchs is really quite different than the representation of God in the story of Joseph, for instance. And I was looking at Psalm 88 this morning, as I mentioned to you earlier. It's a lament in which the problem is God is hiding his face. So the problem is precisely that God is not present and immediate in the life of this one desperate follower, who nonetheless is speaking to God, maybe without a lot of confidence of being answered. God takes sides. Yes, although I would say, and I'm not quite sure how you want to relate that to science, but God does not, the sides are not clearly reducible to ethnicity, to being ethnically and tribally defined. There are lots and lots of challenges to that. So, what do you do with the fact that Uriah the Hittite is obviously a more faithful follower of Israel's God than David the king? That in the book of Joshua, the Gibeonites are lying and cheating their way to get into the covenant, that the Israelites are only too lax in observing. It is complicated. And so, I could go on, but we need to talk about specific instances because it doesn't do, I think, finally, to deal with this question, or perhaps very many others, in generalities.
Well, Dr. Davis, we are out of time, and it has been such a pleasure and an honor to learn from you this morning. It was a dream that Jacob and I have been hoping for many years. I don't know if you know this, but you are the stuff of legends. I remember in seminary, people would talk about you after reading your book and say, oh my gosh, I heard that she doesn't eat food. She just subsists on the Eucharist. And she basically floats when she walks. And, I don't know if you know that those are things that are being said about you.
Well, now we know how legends get started, don't we?
But it truly is a pleasure. And I think those rumors come because you just spout wisdom in everything you say. And so we were taking notes ourselves, and we're definitely going to invite everyone to read your books, and perhaps we can do some book studies here at our church and further these conversations.
It's been great to be with you this morning, and a good worship to you. Okay,
Thank
bye.
you so much. Goodbye, everyone.
See everyone in worship.